The next question is on the current situation with Sudan, and this comes actually from inside the current Obama administration. It says, Mr. LaRouche, as I think you know, we've been under enormous pressure to take a public position on the recent ICC indictment of President Bashir, and that pressure doesn't come from just outside the United States. While so far the president has not felt the need to respond to the warrant itself, he does feel the need to respond to the indisputable suffering in the area. The issuance of the warrant provoked a response by the Sudanese that included the expulsion of a number of organizations that were providing humanitarian relief in an area that desperately needs it. While the Sudanese government has denied that the policy toward Darfur is one of genocide and has repeatedly insisted that it is working to resolve this internal problem, the fact is that the expulsions have done little to help their credibility in this area. As I think you know, the Secretary of State has urged President Bashir to allow these organizations back in, but so far has received no response. You seem to enjoy very good relations with Sudan and with other nations in Africa. Could you please comment on why it is you believe that the Sudanese government has been so resistant to allowing and accepting this humanitarian relief?
Well, that's a tricky question, because it's not really true. See, the problem is in the case of Susan Rice, and Susan Rice has blocked any attempt to secure competent information to the State Department or anybody else. Now, there are people in the State Department area, or former members and so forth, who could handle this problem, who know the truth about Darfur and what Mrs. So forth has given in general is not the truth. And the issue of this so-called humanitarian organizations has a twist on it which is absolutely opposite to what she thinks it is. If you go back to 1898, I think it's important I say this because because of Susan Rice, no one, I think, in the Obama government actually has anything competent to know about Sudan, including the Secretary of State. Does not know the truth. And the fact that a lie is believed is the problem. And there are people who are senior specialists in State Department of Related Affairs who are intimately acquainted of the truth of the matter. But Susan Rice has prevented that information from getting into the proper channels in the State Department and elsewhere. Right? So what the problem we're dealing with here is the Secretary of State has been subjected to a lie and therefore tends to believe that there is a problem with the humanitarian organizations. All right, let's go through what she should have known if she'd been able to have access to competent, trustworthy resources. Right? The history of Darfur goes back to the period in which Kitchener had subjugated Sudan. In that period, you had a conflict between the British and French colonial programs. Chad was the French side. Sudan was on the English side. When Kitchener conquered Sudan, France gave up some of its claims. Now, in a border area, which is called Darfur today, there were two principal tribes. One of largely Chadian side of the fence, the other the largely Darfur side of the fence. Under an agreement with the French, the British had the area which was disputed territory between these two tribes cut so that the larger part is located in Sudan. Since that time, under continued British occupation, since 1898, the entire area has been controlled by British intelligence operations and occasionally French contrary operations. The tribes are ragged tribes. It's an area in which the population is poor, and it's also the water levels have been dropping. Therefore, the starvation, the conditions of life have been deteriorating. There have also been efforts by various interventions by foreign agencies into Sudan to prevent the Sudan government from dealing with this problem, from exerting its authority in the territory. So there is the humanitarian groups, so-called, are typical of this. Many of the humanitarian groups are actually intelligence operations operating to stir things up there. Now, some of them may be doing some good, but many are not. And the only way to deal with the problem is to have the Sudan government with support straighten the mess out. Those which are legitimate, which are not foreign intelligence operations, fine. Let the Sudan government decide what it wants to do with that. I'm sure it will enjoy their cooperation. But what about the organizations which pretend to be humanitarian, but which are in there stirring up the typical kind of mess and causing the bloodshed, inciting it, or otherwise? So therefore, the policy of the United States is a weak-kneed one. Susan Rice ought to be told to stick to her business and not interfere with the functions of the Secretary of State in making a judgment on these areas. I think that the idea that Susan Rice having an independent voice in this thing is an abomination. She should stick to her job of representation to the United Nations organization and not try to make policy, which is a State Department area. And the Secretary of State should have access to people who know the area, who are experts, who would tell her the truth, and gladly, or would assist her to find out for herself. We have no problem with Bashir as the United States. No problem in the area. We have a problem of Africa, as I mentioned. I have seen a recent, large, specialized report on Africa, of helicopter studies of every part of Africa. I will tell you on the result of that the British operations in Africa are genocidal. Now, what's the ICC? The ICC is a creation of the largest drug pusher in the world. Most extensive. George Soros. He created it. He created it with the British Parliamentary Office of Lord Malloch Brown, who was his crony. George Soros created the drug operation in Mexico, and so forth and so on. So the problem here is, let's wake up to reality. First of all, we should shut down the warrant. We should close down the ICC. It is not a legitimate function. It's a British intelligence operation. And if you try to do anything repressive against Sudan, you'll cause a chain reaction throughout the region, and the United States government will not survive that chain reaction. There's tremendous pressure and bullying on this issue when it comes from sources like the British government and George Soros. I think, again, if we recognize that the present British government is the enemy of the United States, but without making war on it, actually physical shooting war on it, we'll just hope that we get rid of the Fabians and that they will settle on themselves on something decent, a decent arrangement. And there are people in the United Kingdom who do want a decent arrangement. They don't want any more of this Blair kind of Fabianism. And that's the problem. So one should not take these things and try to negotiate with them on the basis of misinformation, like this information about the problem of the so-called humanitarian organizations, many of which are actually fomenting the problem. And if the United States government instead went to Bashir and said, okay, What do we want? We're a new administration. We're not the Bush administration, that racist bunch of swine. Talk to us. What can we do to solve the problem? You don't need these kinds of resolutions for the outside. You don't need to throw stink bombs in other people's backyards where they're friendly. And I can tell you that I know Bashir, and this against him is fraudulent. I know what's happened. I've been into this area since 1994. I know the history of the area. I know many of the personalities in the area. I've been in-depth operations and investigations in that area. At one point, I was actually dealing with the tribes in the South, so-called tribes in the South, at the designation of Bashir. And they asked me as a friendly agency to deal with these people and try to find out what they want and try to assist in bringing about peaceful negotiation between them. I know the area very well, as the Secretary of State does not. And everyone who does know it inside the U.S. diplomatic community really knows it, knows what I know. And the Obama government was lied to largely with the complicity of Susan Rice.